And the other important part of the convention I hadn't mentioned was that it stresses the importance of social dialogue, of freedom of association, and the right to collective bargaining as a basis for, and these are fundamental ILO conventions, as a basis for implementing the provisions. So ideally, we would want to see the convention and the recommendation as a blueprint, as a guide, really, for collective bargaining. Now, I understand in India, collective bargaining doesn't extend to all workers and all sectors, but where it does exist, it can be an important basis for integration into collective bargaining agreements at a sectoral and workplace and indeed at a national level. And I know that already in the transport sector, the public sector, and I think also in the banking sector, the trade unions have begun discussions with employers about this. So that's a route in for the countries where ratification isn't happening. And indeed, for those countries that haven't yet been able to ratify, because this can take quite a long period of time in getting your laws in place, it's still a blueprint to start the process of implementing these issues at workplace level. And there's many countries across the world. So far, there are 3 formal ratifications that have taken place. The first was from Uruguay, the second from Fiji, and the third from Namibia. There are a whole list of other countries now who have already approved ratification through their parliaments, including Argentina, Italy, South Africa, I believe, Paraguay, and a whole range of other countries that are preparing their laws. Most of the countries of the European Union, for example, are currently preparing the laws for ratification. Because although in Europe, our laws are very, very good on sexual harassment at work, those include domestic violence provisions. Laws on domestic violence provisions in the workplace, for example, leave for victims of domestic violence, are much more commonly found in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, some parts of Argentina in local laws, whereas in most European countries, it has been through collective agreements and workplace negotiations that domestic violence supports have been implemented. So I just wanted to bring in this issue about violence and harassment in the world of work and where it occurs, because I think this is really important when we're thinking about domestic violence and where domestic violence occurs. So it can occur in the workplace itself, including the public and private places where they are a place of work. It could be in places where the worker is paid, takes a rest break or a meal, or uses sanitary, washing and changing facilities. It could be during work-related trips, travel, training events, or social activities. It could be through workplace or work-related communications and those enabled by information and communications technologies, in employer-provided accommodation, and when commuting to and from work. And I mentioned just employer-provided accommodation because we know, for example, in the garment sector, in Southeast Asia in particular, that often garment workers migrate from rural areas to work in very large garment factories. The employer provides accommodation as part of that. It could be, a set of dormitories attached, in many cases, attached to the garment factory itself. And we know of cases where, for example, domestic violence has been perpetrated in that employer-provided accommodation, in which case that would also be an area where the employer would have responsibility. And when commuting to and from work. In relation to domestic violence, often an abuser knows the route that somebody takes when they're commuting to and from work. So this is really important. Obviously, all of these issues apply to other forms of gender-based violence and sexual harassment, but they also apply to domestic violence. This very broad definition of world of work is transformational for people working in the area of violence and harassment prevention, including domestic violence. I just want to say a few words about carrying out a risk assessment on domestic violence and what that might include. And if I have time at the end, I just wanted to say a few words about some of the learning and insights from the research that we've done of Vodafone's policy, but I hope, maybe have a little bit of time for that. So what does it mean to carry out a risk assessment on domestic violence? What does that mean in practice? What we have advised employers, and this comes out of research carried out in many countries, because we know that one of the issues about domestic violence is that we want to prevent it occurring in the workplace. The workplace is one site of prevention. We can't expect employers to be responsible for dealing with the issue of risk assessment outside of the workplace, but inside the workplace, there is an occupational safety and health obligation, and somebody is working from home. Interestingly, on this issue of the duty of care of employers, it's worth noting that a recent judgment in Australia, in the High Court in New South Wales, recently made a judgment that the employer has a duty of care when domestic violence occurs while somebody is carrying out work for that employer when they're at home. And this arose because there had been a femicide. A woman had been murdered by her husband while she was working. She was on the computer, she was working. Her children, her adult children, took a case through the High Court for compensation on the basis that the employer had a duty of care while she was working, and therefore had a duty to give compensation for her femicide. And the court ruled that that was the case, and ruled that the duty of care is on an employer to ensure that somebody is safe while they're doing work for them. It's hugely important judgment that will apply in New South Wales, but it sent shivers down the spines of many employers who really seriously believed that they didn't have a responsibility when somebody was working from home. Anyway, just going back to this slide on risk assessment. So a risk assessment is a tool to prevent violence and harassment occurring in the workplace. It's an occupational safety and health measure, but it can be applied specifically to risk assessment where somebody has identified their fear or concern that they may be affected by domestic violence. So this could be a situation where somebody has left a violent partner, they know where to find them, and they have threatened them. They have threatened that they will come to the workplace. They have threatened them with death, rape, violence, or other forms of violence and harassment, for example, in person. So what we would always say is carry out risk assessment with the survivor, ensure confidentiality, address risks for the survivor. For example, what's the case when they're traveling to and from work? Do they need to change their routes that they take? Do they need to change their patterns of transport? What are the risks, for example, in the car park or in public places or in parts of the workplace where a perpetrator can access them? Or it could be around phone or digital harassment, text, email, online, social media, in which case there would be systems put in place to divert calls or messages. It could be in relation to a survivor's capacity to work to her full potential, taking account of the impact of domestic violence on time off work, productivity, and so on. And it could also be risks for co-workers. It could be risks where a survivor or perpetrator are indeed in the same workplace. So what we would argue is that it's necessary to draw up a safety plan. The safety plan should involve the survivor, her supporters. It could be a trade union representative or an advocate. It could be a work colleague or a friend. And that relevant managers hold regular meetings with her to assess security risks monitor those changes in or escalation of the risk. This is a really important issue, and it's very interesting that some countries are now doing what they call domestic homicide reviews, where a domestic homicide, femicide, has occurred, whether this has included the workplace. So, for example, in Canada, researchers have begun looking back on domestic violence cases where there has been a femicide, and looking at what could have been done to prevent that occurring. And what we know is that often women have highlighted a problem to their manager, they've gone to the police, and nothing has been done. So there's a lot of learning we can take from domestic violence cases of femicide, to prevent those occurring in the future. So prevention is hugely, hugely important. And that's why I just wanted to mention this issue about risk assessment, because it's in Convention 190. So Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 refer to an obligation for employers to carry out risk assessments that take account of gender-based violence, and that include things like third-party violence and harassment in the workplace. And this is a massively important issue around prevention of gender-based violence in the workplace generally, but also of domestic violence. So I've got a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to say a few words about, I'll just take these slides off now. I just wanted to say, how do I do that? There. So I just wanted, I can see some of you now there. I just want to say, just last couple of minutes that I've got, just to say a few words about some of the key learning and insights from the Vodafone policy. We did a big survey at the end of last year to try and find out how the policy, the domestic violence policy, had been implemented in practice. And I think I mentioned to you that Vodafone operates in many markets across the world. They're a multinational company, and that they also operate in India. 95% of Vodafone's markets had already said that they had the policy had been implemented, and that it had been extremely or very important in enabling them to give support to employees affected by domestic violence. And I think this confirms the importance of having a workplace policy in place. 80% of those markets, and this included India, had already completed or had plans for ongoing training with line managers and HR personnel about implementing the policy and providing workplace supports for victims of domestic violence. 68% had been had referred survivors of domestic violence to employee assistance programs for counselling and support. 64% of markets had provided paid leave for employees who needed time to adjust to moving home, attending court appointments, appointments with police, or indeed for counselling. And 55% of markets had referred survivors to domestic violence or other organisations for legal and other support, housing and so on. Just finally, in terms of the key learning and insights, what we know is that the policy and the guidance and the communication support has really made a difference in all of Vodafone's markets. Crucial to this has been leadership and advocacy to create a policy where the workplace is inclusive, is based on equality, and builds trust amongst employees. And that's a really important point to make. And whether we're talking about sexual harassment at work or whether we're talking about domestic violence, if somebody doesn't have trust in their line manager or in the policy, they're not going to talk about the issue. It's shrouded in victim blaming, silence, stigma, and so on. So that's why it's really important that the policy builds trust, awareness, and understanding that if you talk about domestic violence or ask for help, there'll be no recriminations. The next issue is that line managers who had received training felt empowered to give support in a non-judgmental and empathetic way for survivors, and that the training had been absolutely crucial to the implementation of the policy and implementation of frontline supports. Survivors had, as I mentioned, taken up a range of supports, including paid leave, and good partnerships had been developed with domestic violence organisations. In some countries, the partnerships had been a direct partnership between the Vodafone company and a domestic violence organisation. And this has been very important in terms of referrals, but they had also helped with training or with giving support to the domestic violence organisation as well. And I think we can conclude that, policies like the policy of Vodafone, you can find Vodafone's policies online, actually. If you Google Vodafone policy on domestic violence and abuse and the domestic violence and abuse toolkit, they're publicly available. But I think they show that a difference can be made. And now that we have Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 from the International Labour Organization, we have a very, very strong framework for dealing with this issue. So I think my time is up. I'd like to wish you all, best of luck with your conference today, and I hope you have a really, really interesting discussions and presentations. You have some really fantastic range of speakers, and just to say, keep up the good work, and it's great to see this work and this conference taking place. So I wish you a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jen Pillinger, for your extremely wonderful and I would say provocative sort of address that has not only touched often the key areas that are responsible for the kind of continued violence against women, but also offered certain feasible measures that may be taken to stop the violence. And it is interesting to see how Dr. Pillinger has actually argued for the need for extension of the idea of domestic violence. Because without this kind of understanding, we will fail to recognize the real danger that is lying all ahead. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I once again thank you very much for making time out of your busy schedule to share your ideas with us in this virtual way from so far of place. So thank you once again, uh, Dr.
Thank
Fellinger.
you.
Now, with this, I conclude this particular session, which has been extremely interesting and intellectually stimulating. I now invite Dr. Shreyasi Chatterjee to carry forward this critique of this domestic violence and all that. Okay, so over to you, Dr. Chatterjee. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Das. We really had a very, very interesting and thought-provoking keynote session, and through that, we realized that the increased instances of gender violence and domestic violence during the lockdown may have been given the moniker shadow pandemic. Yet, instances of gender violence is neither a new phenomenon nor was it unexpected. The same structural injustices and inequalities that impacted the lives of the vulnerable and the marginalized before the crisis of the pandemic now simply determines who suffers the most from it. Investing in the elimination of gender-based violence is considered smart economics. Violence against vulnerable genders is one of the primary barriers to their participation in the economic, social, and political spheres. Not to mention, it has a huge economic cost. Work from home norms create more opportunities for abuse, both physical and coercive control. Support needs to be tailored to pave safe ways of communication. Thus, the need of the hour is a joint effort to successfully respond to the rise in gender based violence cases during the pandemic. Lawmakers, policymakers, law enforcement, civil society organizations, service providers, researchers all play a vital role in helping survivors come out of this cycle of violence. Our first session, titled Gender Justice to Cope with the Shadow Pandemic, explores this elusive concept of gender justice. Gender justice entails ending the inequalities between genders that are produced and reproduced in the family, the community, the market, and the state. All mainstream institutions, from justice to policy making, are accountable for tackling the injustice and discrimination that keep too many of vulnerable genders excluded. This session will look into how thinking about and addressing gender inequalities will be an essential tool for fighting against gender based violence amidst the pandemic. I will now like to invite Dr. Alpuna Ray to welcome and introduce our distinguished resource persons for this session. Over to you, Dr. Ray. Dr. Ray, you are muted and nobody can hear you.
Yeah. Now am I audible? Can I? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah. Thank you once again, Dr. Chatterjee, for giving me the opportunity to chairing the session one, which is about gender justice to cope with the shadow pandemic. We have three eminent speakers in this session. The first speaker is Professor Mary E. John, who is presently Acting Director and Professor, Center for Women Development Studies, New Delhi. Professor Mary E. John completed her BSc from Bangalore University and her Masters in Economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has completed her MPhil from the University of Pune. Professor Mary John obtained her PhD degree in Women's Studies through the Interdisciplinary Doctoral Program at the University of California. Professor John has been working in the fields of women's studies and feminist politics for many years. She began her career as visiting professor at Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, Paris, France. She has served as a principal investigator for many research projects supported by organizations like UNIFEM, UNFPA, UN Women and Food Ford Foundation. She served as a coordinator for a project sponsored by Action Aid India with financial assistance from IDRC Canada. She has served as a consultant to UN Women for Gender and Equity in Higher Education for the 12th Five-Year Plan and Sex Ratios and Sex Selections Research Overview. She was a visiting scholar and Hughes Fellow, Center for South Asian Studies, University of Michigan. She has served as an associate professor, Women's Studies Program, School of Social Science, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Professor Mary John is presently a professor at Center for Women Development Studies, New Delhi. Professor John has been coordinator of research refresher courses in women's studies at Jadavpur, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and at Isabella Urban College, Lucknow. She has taught both MA and MPhil course at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has been a visiting professor at the Summer School in Women's Studies on transnational feminist knowledge in Asia, Eva University, Seoul, Korea. She has been the coordinator for 6 weeks intensive Women's Studies Research Training Certificate course at the Center for Women's Development Studies with ICSSR support. She has also been the coordinator for MPhil PhD program in Women and Gender Studies in collaboration with Ambedkar University, Delhi. From 2001 to 2006, she served as a Deputy Director, Women's Studies Program, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and from 2006 to 2012, she served as the Director, Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi, for 2 terms. She is currently the acting director at the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi. Professor John has authored several books on women's studies, gender and work, feminism and sexuality. She has written several reports for UNFPA, UN Women, CWDS, UGC and IDS, University of Sussex. She has also been the guest editor for several journals like the Economic and Political Weekly, Indian Journal of Gender Studies, and International Journal of Post-Colonial Studies. Now, I would like to welcome her, and also I would like to request her to deliver a lecture in this session. Professor John, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm overwhelmed by your introduction. I think you've gone to great lengths to introduce me. Thank you. So thanks to PC Mahalanobis Mahavidyalaya and also to the ICSR Eastern region for this opportunity. I think you have chosen a difficult topic for a seminar. In my session, I thought I would, and you've just had two, I think, excellent presentations already, very, very comprehensive. One giving you an overview, if I'm not mistaken, of the pandemic overall, even globally, and the other going to very excellent detail into issues of violence, domestic violence, workplace violence. So a great deal has already been actually accomplished in your initial addresses. I thought today in my session I would actually step back a bit and be a little more, and I don't have a PowerPoint, I wanted to be a little more conversational, and I think we will have hopefully time for a few questions. I wanted to look at the question of gender a little more, not even the question of justice. I think there are two other speakers, so I'm hoping they will take that up more closely so that we get a better sense of what we're talking about. When we say gender, when we use terms like shadow pandemic, um, the times that we are in, which is not just the times of a pandemic, but also times of a lockdown and its consequences. So, what is this term gender? Because there can be, and I'm not saying that anybody has done this before, but we in our everyday usage of the term often simply think of it as another word for women. And gender is actually a complex concept taken out of linguistics and applied to the social world, where it has come to mean the many, many different ways in which we acquire the identities that we do. Socially acquired are usually those of men and women through a range of relations, through a range of processes, through structures, and so on, that actually make most of what we do have gendered aspects, gendered outcomes. So we have, of course, we're very used to the idea that, and so socially, our societies have tended to think that we are basically two genders, men and women. That is actually not the case. And that is beginning to also become recognized more. I mean, in whatever form, we now even have a government law that tells us that there is a third gender. So what this term gender then is, I think it should be obvious then, is that it's not simply another word for women. And it's certainly not a term that we can take for granted. So if we think of gender in this way, that is to say, we think of gender as a process, a set of structures that tend to reinforce certain processes that are very keen to turn us into societies across the world appear, even in all their cultural differences and all their economic and social differences, all of them appear to be quite keen to turn us into men and women, to turn little babies into little girls and little boys, and so on. And it's a very, it's interesting, and all of you should think about this, that there is nothing automatic and nothing biologically determined about it. Because if in fact it were biologically fixed, if in fact it were so straightforward that little boys will invariably turn into successful men and little girls will invariably turn into successful women with the right characteristics, if that were indeed the case, then there would be no need to put in place so many mechanisms, so many processes, so many ways of policing and shaping and cajoling and punishing us if we in fact deviate from those paths, if it were in fact so obvious or so clear. Um, Now, given the context within which we are thinking today, um, given the fact that the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown has achieved something quite interesting. So it's been devastating. Don't and that's my point. Is not that it has been a positive thing. I think almost entirely the pandemic is a disease. It has affected us negatively. Uh, the lockdown has been worldwide, it has been what one simply could say unprecedented, and its consequence has been to bring, in its early stages, it was to bring the whole world to a halt. I mean, I think nothing like this has ever been witnessed in the world before. It brought economies to a halt, and one of the effects of trying to ensure safety, that is to say, trying to ensure the prevention of spread, was to have a very, very stringent lockdown. The one in India was amongst the most stringent anywhere because it was almost without any notice. And it took the form of saying that you have to stay at home. Now, the sphere of the home is one of the spheres that has interested all of us who are working in the sphere of women and gender studies enormously, because it is one of the spheres that women are most identified with. And it's not, I think, accidental that in this previous speaker had to spend so much time talking about domestic violence, and pointed out that this was even of relevance to people when they went out of their homes to work, and that the most recent ILO laws have in fact alerted employers to the fact that what happens in the home is relevant to them. So the interesting thing is that the home that otherwise was tending in our ordinary everyday lives, what happens is that our lives sort of take over. I think it's been so long now, we've almost forgotten what that was like. And the home tended to sort of recede into the background. So the curious thing is that what this pandemic has done and what public discourse around it has done is to bring the home into public view. So in some senses, you could say that shadow that you refer to in your title is less of a shadow today. I doubt whether you would have had the kind of discussion that you had this morning if there had been no pandemic. So we are having a situation where, in some ways, gender in this shadow sphere called the home is less in the shadows, or we'd like to think it is less in the shadows because it is more in the public eye. And why is it more in the public eye? Because people have been locked down or locked in, depending on how you look at it, have been locked into their homes. So what kind of space is the home is what I would like to discuss with you a little bit, and look at it from two vantage points. One is that of the family. This is so if you think of gender, what I just talked about in terms of gender, in relationship to this concept of the family, it's a sociological concept. It's a concept from kinship. It is about people who are related in some way through biology or other means as members. And the membership is in some sense structured very much by gender in very obvious ways, as well as by other factors like age. So a family is composed of various members, men, women, boys, girls, elders, younger, other kinship members, depending on if they are present, higher or older generations. If it's a joint family, then other uncles and aunts and so on will also be there. And we have a very elaborate vocabulary in our Indian languages. In Bengali, I'm sure you have a very big vocabulary to deal with members of the family, where we use a lot of terminology to indicate as much the gender as the age of the person. You have, in fact, in Bengali, you have these suffixes of da and the for anyone who's older than yourself, and so on. So the family then is one kind of structure that occupies the home. The second way of looking at the home, and since this is the PC Mahalanobis Mahavidyalaya, I don't know whether many of you are economists. He was, after all, one of our most famous economists and statisticians. So the other way to look at the home is the household, the notion of the household. And the household is more of an economic notion. If the family is a kinship and social institution, then the household refers to an economic unit. In fact, in older times, the household was the unit of the economy. And that's what the word economy, in fact, the word economy itself comes from a Greek word that means home. That means the unit. Nowadays, we hardly think of the home as an economic unit. But indeed, before capitalism came along, that was indeed the concept, that the home was the site of production. The home was the site where value and products were created. So in a household sense, then, how do we think of the household today? In the conditions of the pandemic, what kind of gender relations are there here? And here we need to ask ourselves the question, who is doing what kind of work in the household? And I'm asking this question, first of all, apart from the pandemic, apart from this new WFH term that has become part of our everyday vocabulary, work from home. I'm asking in a standard sense, who does what? And this is, of course, where gender and feminist work has been at its best in opening up for us the domain that was thought, far from being an economic unit. The domain of the home and the domain of the household after capitalism has been more and more not just marginalized, but thought of as a space where no work actually is done, where no value of any economic nature is produced, where the home is somehow only thought of as a space of social relations, as a space of love and care in ways that empty it as though of economic content. So it has required, in fact, considerable feminist work and pressure and struggle to reopen and relook at this space and say that there is a household here where a great deal of work is happening. And in fact, if you look at all the work that happens in homes, around homes, and connect that to all the other work that does get recognized by the market, then in fact, women as a group are doing a lot more work than men as a group. And this is equally true in India, even in a country like ours, where women have very low work participation rates compared to the rest of the world. So the household is a space of work. And this work is absolutely essential for the reproduction of the household and therefore also of society. If in fact, all the work that was being done in homes, we sometimes joke about it, that if the women who are in fact carrying the largest burdens of the work being done at home, if they were to go on strike tomorrow and decide that they were going to stop working, the society as we know it would actually collapse. Such is the absolutely pivotal nature of the reproduction of the family, the reproduction of people through all the labors that go into the home. Now, when we bring the household and the family together, one of the most interesting things that we may notice, especially in Indian households and especially in middle class, I'm assuming many of you are from middle class homes, then the two are not exactly the same. That is to say, all those who are working in a household to reproduce the household are not exactly the same as all those who are members of a given family. There are others who enter and leave households to carry out this work of reproduction. And the most common and most typical of them is the maidservant. It can be male, it can be female, of course. And in fact, you're in Kolkata, and Kolkata has some very, very interesting studies of the work of servants across history and in time, where in fact, what used to be there, you have had a history of male servants in Kolkata homes historically, which has more and more given way, usually live-in, men who lived with the family in a feudal, more or less feudal relationship and carried out all the work that was assigned to them. That relationship has more and more given way to having live-in girls, sometimes children. You have your Calcutta is well known for having a very remarkably high proportion of child workers who are girls working in people's homes, and you have the more common, which all of us are much more familiar with, which is women who are live out, as they say, who come and go and work in several people's houses. And more, the Indian household depends on, to a considerable degree, depending on the status of a household. The poorer it is, the less the chances are that it has any such person assisting in the reproduction of the labor that is required for sustaining a family. And the further up you go in terms of class relations, the more you will see people, more than one, and additional people as well. You will have a Mali, you will have a driver, you will have a nanny to look after the children. More and more, this household starts to get populated beyond the family. So one of the most interesting things that happened consequent, I do not know about Kolkata, I live in Delhi. One of the most interesting things that happened in families and households after the lockdown took place was whether or not you still had a servant to come and do the work that they used to do. If they were live in, they might still be living in. But if they were live out, if they were coming from a neighborhood or from somewhere rather far away, then by virtue of that pandemic, they were no longer in a position to come. In fact, their work ended. They lost their jobs. And that is the other thing one should say about this pandemic. So there are those who lost their jobs, who did have sources of earning outside, men and women both. And then there are those who did not lose their jobs. People like myself, and I probably may all of you, did not lose your jobs. You started working from home. So your home became your workplace, right? So homes then were transformed, consequent to the lockdown, into spaces where, according to different genders, but I'm hoping you can also sense from what I'm saying, that genders itself is not just marked by age, but marked by class, marked by caste, marked by kinds of work that is recognized or not recognized. And it is this sum total that we have to look at when we think about the shadow pandemic. In other words, we must understand and think about what has changed in our home spaces, in this case I'm looking at, so that we could then ask ourselves, what would gender justice look like? Who are those who have now occupied this space? Who are those who are still occupying this space? What has transformed as a consequence of the pandemic? Are there those who have lost jobs? Are there those who are working from home? Are there children of various ages who now have to learn from home? And who is then taking over all the labors, all the work, all the tasks, all the caring that goes into enabling this household to function and not collapse? Right? It's quite an amazing situation to imagine how have our worlds actually continued under such conditions. And so one of the I ask, and my everyday experiences are in Delhi. One of the curious things that happened in a world where we are so gender divided in terms of the labor, where women do the housework and paid women on the whole do the cleaning and so on of the homes in which they are brought. One of the curious things was that post the pandemic, when the maids could no longer come and the cleaning of the floors and the other cleaning daily work could no longer take place, there was a little bit of a, how can I say, a little bit of a disturbance was created in the conventional gender division of labor. So, and this had even a market dimension. So, for instance, there was a new market that was created for stand-up brooms, for brooms that were for mops and brooms that came with a stand-up handle, a mop at the bottom, and a bucket, where you could stand and clean it rather than using the usual, pocha, as we say in Hindi, to bend, where the maid servant usually had to bend over double to wash and clean our floors. So one of the questions one could ask is, Was it for the first time, perhaps, that people who had never cleaned floors before were now having to clean a floor because the women were busy doing other things? Uh, who was cleaning? Could it be that this new technology, as it were, that came into the home indicated that there might even be a man or two who might be now cleaning the floor, but who would want to do it from an upright position and not by bending over? This is what I heard anecdotally from a number of families, that now the men, actually a few of them who are a little more sensitive to the needs of the who now saw for the first time, perhaps even now that they were at home, they could see to some extent the extent to which what extent of labors were required to maintain a clean, tidy, happy household. So, was there, in other words, a little bit of a positive change insofar as, because I know your main topic is violence, but I think we should look at violence in a slightly more nuanced way and not in a stereotypical way. No doubt violence has increased, and that all the numbers that are out there would tell us this. But let us place this in some sort of a context also and ask ourselves more in a more open-ended way, what has changed in our lives now, in a middle class home, consequent to the lives that we are leading now? To what extent have gender relations simply been cemented? Have they simply gotten worse? Have the women in the home got to slave even more than they ever did before? Are they now not just doing the cooking, but they're also looking after the children's homework and the elders and everybody else, and the husband who's now fed up because he can't go out and socialize and have his job satisfaction as he used to? Is the woman turning into a complete slave in the home? Are children becoming more and more, that's another whole realm. If you think of gender justice, then what about the world of children who have been denied, as you, I think, well know, and you know it in your own lives, you've read about it, are being denied the chance to go to school for good reason. The pandemic does mean that you cannot go to class. But what consequences follow from that? What does it mean to study from home? Who can study from home? Are there new divisions between genders or between ages, depending on the technologies required for study? And so on. I mean, you can multiply, in other words, the issues here. I just want to open this out for you so that we can think in a more, how shall I say, more interesting and a more constructive way about the meaning of gender in the time of the pandemic. And the shadows that are, I would suggest, are there are not just the shadow of violence. They're the shadow of class, they're the shadow of labor, they're the shadow of who counts more or less in these times. I'll stop here and I hope that we can have some discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Professor John. I would like Dr. Alpona Ray to please come in and conclude this session. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. On behalf of organizing committee, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for her wonderful lecture and insightful presentation. Now, I would like to request Ms. Isha Vishwas to conduct the question answer session for this chapter. And over to Ms. Vishwas.
Thank you. I would like to ask Dr. Mary John a few questions that we have gathered. Oh, the first is from Dr. Saroshi Chatterjee herself, who asks if or is gender justice a concern for men as well? Professor John?
Yes. No, that's a very large question. I'm not sure in what senses you mean it. Do you mean that victims of gender injustice? Because I think the question of justice implies a wrongdoing and a righting of a wrong. That's what we think. That's what we think of when we think of justice. And I thought others after me might speak on that because I didn't address that. So, do we think? Are you asking the question in the sense of that men can be victims of gender injustice, which is the more interesting question, and because obviously they can be the perpetrators perpetrators of gender injustice. I mean, that would be the more common, obvious, it's you heard about that in any case when it came to violence, that that men would be the most frequent perpetrators, and the most frequent victims would be women. But it is not at all the case that men are only perpetrators. And the most example of that would be people who are minors, that is to say children, that is those who are considered not yet adult. When it comes to persons of below age, then we look at all genders. Let me put it that way, all genders, that is to say men, women, and any other gender or person can be a victim of injustice, of violence on the part of adults. And it can even be women. Women as adults can be perpetrators on children, including boy children. So if that is what you were trying to get at, yes. When it comes to adults, I do not know whether we have too many. What we do have are examples, and some of our sexual harassment guidelines. I was on the if since you're interested in issues of violence, I was the co-chair of the UGC task force on issues, looking into issues after the so-called Nirbhaya case, and we have brought out the Saksham report. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's on the UGC website. Take a look at it. And in those guidelines, we have in fact said that men can be victims of violence. The most if when men are seen to deviate from their assigned, as I told you, a lot of labor, a lot of work has to go into producing us as men and women in society. And when there are men who do not subscribe to, who do not follow from, and as little boys onwards, so when they do not subscribe to the norms of the masculine gender, they are punished for it. They are subjected to injustices of all kinds. So yes, that can, and that injustice again can be at the hands of a woman or man. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you, Dr. John. I have a question from my side as well. My question is, even prior to lockdown and especially after it, working women mostly would bear the double burden of paid employment on one hand and of unpaid household care responsibilities on the other hand. So could there be a policy framework in place that may progress us towards a possible solution to this double?
Well, it's not just a double burden. There has been a great, and I don't know what your subject is, whether you're an economist, there is enormous amounts of work on this. So you just have to look it up. We have been debating the nature of women's labor in India for a long time. In fact, I just co-edited a volume on it. If it interests you, called Women in the Worlds of Labor. Take a look at that, which has a lot of essays on the subject. The curious thing, as I mentioned in passing, is that actually very few women are employed in the sense of receiving remuneration. In India, we have one of the lowest work participation rates. School teachers and maid servants are the number one and number two employees in urban India, and the others are very, very low down on that scale. So most women are in fact not gainfully employed. But you are absolutely right that even those who are gainfully employed, it does not change the domestic division of labor. At most, what happens is, and I indicated this also in my talk, that we displace some of the more onerous aspects of that work onto others who are even lower in status and pay them hopeless wages for that work, which is the maid servants. So the maid servants carry out the more, what shall I say, depending on the status of the household, they carry out a range of labor that otherwise would fall upon the shoulders of the woman herself. Yes, so she is able to the shifting of that burden, that double burden you mentioned, is achieved by this kind of displacement rather than other ways in which the division of labor could be shared. Yes, this is what we have invariably done, and there is a lot of work on this, and a lot of we should be doing as a consequence.
Thank you so much, Professor John. I'm not an economist. I am a literature lecturer, so I had a lot of questions about this.
Okay.
But thank you for being patient with me. Thank you so much for this enlightening, enriching talk. I would now request Dr. Alpuna Ray to come forward and introduce our next speaker. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Vishwas. Thank you, Ms. Vishwas. Now we are proceeding to the second lecture of the session, and also would like to welcome Ms. Ruchira Goswami. She is an assistant professor in social sciences in the West Bengal National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata, India. Ruchira Goswami teaches at the National University of Judicial, where she offers courses in sociology, human rights, gender and law, child rights, and film and law. She was the head of the Center for Child Rights, NUGS, a multidisciplinary center set up in the partnership with the UNICEF with the mandate of research, documentation, and advocacy on child rights issues. A British evening scholar in human rights from the London School of Economics. Her areas of interest include feminist movements and the legal reforms, child rights, representation of law in films, and intellectual property and human rights. Her publications are in the international women rights, intellectual property and women rights, right to food, etc. She has taught in a number of institutions, including Presidency University, National Development Studies, University of Oslo, Norway. She is closely associated with several human rights organizations in the city and outside, and also conducts various workshops and capacity building programs on human rights issues with various stakeholders. Now, I would like to welcome her, and also I would like to request her to deliver her lecture in this session. Over to you, ma'am.
Good morning, and thank you very much to the organizing committee of Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis Mahavidyalaya for giving me an opportunity to share my thoughts on the pandemic and on violence against women related to it. So I'll speak on a couple of points that I think Professor John has already covered. So there might be a little bit of an overlap. But I'll try to also talk about two other categories, which I believe also necessitates discussion. Briefly, I'll also talk about children and how they have been affected by the pandemic. And because we're talking about gender-based violence and gender justice, it is perhaps also necessary to talk about trans persons today, and what the pandemic has done to transgender people. So I will briefly touch upon a couple of points there. Before I proceed, I hope everybody could hear me clearly and it's okay. There is no problem in the volume. I hope it's okay.
It is absolutely all right. We can hear you clearly, ma'am.
Thank you, Suresh. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about figures and then come into the more conceptual discussion about gender justice. So while it is true that a virus doesn't distinguish on the basis of social hierarchies, it is already clear that the brunt of the pandemic is faced by the disadvantaged and marginalized populations. In our case, we are primarily talking about women. History shows that whenever there is an outbreak, social divisions and hierarchies amplify, and deep-rooted social prejudices resurface. Within a couple of months of the pandemic, skewed gender relations and power differentials were evident. Globally and in India, there has been an exponential rise in violence against women and girls, and also, all kinds of children, both boys and girls. And there has been an exponential rise in domestic violence, and something that I believe was discussed in the previous sessions. So between May and September of 2020, the National Commission of Women had received online and by WhatsApp, etc., 4,350 complaints. And within a month, there were hundreds of complaints um, about on domestic violence between March and April itself. So much so that in April 2020, the Delhi High Court had directed the center and state governments to hold meetings to tackle domestic violence. So within a month, there was so much of rise that the courts and the state governments had to take notice about this, what we are now calling the shadow pandemic. The other points that I have had has been covered by Professor John, so I'm not going there, which is we have seen that what the pandemic has done was to increase the burden of housework and the brunt of balancing both work at home, work from home, everything was primarily on the women. Point taken that we had seen a rise in sale of brooms, and we had a lot of memes and jokes going on in the social media showing that men were also participating in housework. But that itself is indicative that it is something really new. And as a group, that men are now participating in housework, in doing the dishes, and cleaning the floor, and taking care of children. But globally, the brunt of housework, and more so in South Asian countries, and of course in India, the brunt of it, of what Isha was talking about in terms of double day burden, was faced primarily by women. What else has happened during the pandemic? We have seen that there has been an enormous economic stress globally, with economies absolutely crumbling, and the women were the first to be laid off. Anyway, women have been at the bottom of the pile, and the global gender gap in terms of workforce is huge. India is one of the lowest country in terms of women's workforce participation in paid labor, and the kinds of jobs that women have are primarily in the informal sector and in precarious labor, which means that the first to be laid off when there is an economic recession would be women. And we have seen this continuously all around. So again, I was listening to what Professor John was saying, that while perhaps middle class women who constitute the formal workforce, their jobs weren't gone. There have been many people, many women and men in the formal sector who had to take lesser salary. There were pay cuts, and we know that it has happened in the most highest of corporate sector people as well. And for women who are in informal labor and in precarious labor, like housework, domestic help, nannies, etc., beauticians, etc., women who work in parlors, etc., with all of them shutting down, they all lost their jobs. We know that domestic helps, for a couple of months, people could have paid them, but after that, there was absolutely no payment for them. So the precarity of women's labor was amplified during the pandemic. We have also seen an increase in the gender pay gap globally and also in India. And perhaps when we are talking about women, we are talking about women from lower classes, but also we have to look at it from the point of view of disability. And there is hardly any data emerging from how women with disabilities who might be facing violence inside the home anyway, on account of their disability, and they cannot access services which they need for their well-being. All of that has also been denied. We know that is true for children with disabilities, because I happen to work in the child rights sector as well, that children who are ones with intellectual disabilities or psychosocial disabilities, with schools and special schools for children with disabilities being shut, they didn't know what to do at home, and it became very, very difficult for family members, and the brunt being faced by mothers, to manage children with disabilities at home, given that they needed medication and they needed services which only the special training centers and schools could have given them. So we are unsure, and there isn't a lot of I would say, trustworthy data, apart from anecdotal, on what happens to women with disabilities. So, though we have gender disaggregated data in how women are the greatest victims of the pandemic, within women, what different kinds of women are facing, say Dalit women, women with disabilities, women from rural India, from absolutely the poorest families, how they are coping with the pandemic is something that we really don't know. Even the migrant workers crisis came in as a gendered, it didn't come as a gender disaggregated data. And the marginal, workers crisis was understood, migrant workers crisis was largely understood as that of something that was plaguing men. So we'll have to wait for more and more reports to come in that sense. Let's look a little bit about the gender pay gap and what that has happened. So, according to UN Women Report, which is a United Nations organization, this report is entitled "From Insights to Action: Gender Equality in the Wake of COVID-19." It says this was a report that came in last year. So it states that by the end of 2020, which is something that has already happened, 13% of the world's women and girls, which is 469 million people, will be living in extreme poverty. And 49 million will be impoverished specifically because of COVID 19. So, impoverishment of women has actually increased to the tune of 49 million after the COVID. According to the same report, this number will not revert to the pre pandemic levels until 2030. So, this pandemic, which is roughly now a year, at least till 2030, there is no way of going back to the pre pandemic levels of poverty. It's worse than before. And there has been an 11% increase between 2019 and 2020 in the number of women globally living under $1.9 a day, which is roughly a little less than 100 rupees. And there has been an 11% rise. Let us see what has happened more. The gender poverty gap among those aged between the ages of 25 and 34 years currently exists in 75 of 131 low and middle income countries. Unless there are policies to prevent further impoverishment, an additional 59 countries will need over 70 years to close their gender poverty gap. So clearly, from the UN report, we are seeing that the impact of the pandemic is just not for a year or two. It will take around, according to this report, 70 years to cope with this gender pay gap, and more countries are following into the gender pay gap, the maximum being in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by Asia, South Asia. Okay, so if there is also, and it would be interesting if people can look this up, the UN Women also did a global gender response tracker. So, globally, what were states doing to cope with the pandemic, especially and its impact on women? What are the government measures that have been taken to respond to violence against women and to support unpaid care work and promote economic security of women? So, the Global Gender Response Tracker tries to look at what these countries have been doing for the last 1 year to re-establish economic security, to enable women to come out of unpaid care work, and to prevent and respond to violence against women. And we see that certain things have been done in certain countries, but if you look into the case of India, then we see that state initiatives are there, but that's far, far less than what is desirable. So even before the pandemic, the rate of violence against women was, for every 3 women, 1 woman was facing violence. This was pre-pandemic, and this has exponentially increased after the pandemic. So what is the nature of violence during the pandemic? And we have seen that in India, as I was saying right in the beginning, that it is domestic violence which has gone up because women and children are now locked in, or were locked in during the lockdown phase, and they could not access any help. As you would know, the first couple of months in West Bengal, we could not even go outside the house, and the entire police force was employed to stop people from going out. Anyway, women in India spend most of their time within. Women's access to public spaces has always been limited. And after the lockdown, we see that it was true for both men and women. But even if we had seen men going out when the lockdown was a little relaxed, but women going out to public spaces was so much less. Why were they not going? One is historically because of the women's role being in the private space. Second, that women were busy doing everything in the house. To give you a report that had come out in Bengali Daily, it came out in Anandabajar Potrika a little after the lockdown, which was this case where a family, it was a joint family, where a number of family members were afflicted with the virus, and hospital authorities had come to take away the ones who were affected by the virus. Very interestingly, household members allowed the son of the household, and there was somebody else, the mother-in-law or somebody, who to be taken to the hospital for treatment, but they resisted the going in of the daughter-in-law or the wife to go to the hospital, saying that if she goes, and you know that it would be a 15-day stint, if she goes to the hospital, then who will take care of the home and who will do all the cooking, because the domestic help was not coming in. So look at the level of violence in this little piece of news, that a woman was suffering and she could not go to the hospital because she had to be at home to take care of everything. Also, for a lot of women and also for men, as we know, the collapsing of the private space and the public space was a problem, because at least for some women, of course, and for middle class women, getting out of the house was also, and going to your workspace was also some kind of a freedom and autonomy, a sense of liberation, of connecting with others. Now, caught up in a violent household, or in a household where you're working 18 hours a day from dawn to dusk, and one has to cope with work at home and work from home. And as many of us know, that there was no timeline anymore, that there was no time. Previously, you could come back home by evening, but now you would have a lot of work that could be assigned also in the late evening as well. So, and women had to juggle with all of this together, and had to face also tremendous violence. Now, what did it, why was the sudden exponential rise in domestic violence? One is, and also to say that the official data that we have on violence, data that the NCW had, or at least women who could reach out to the police, which was much less anyway. This is only the tip of the iceberg. We know that there would be millions of women who could not even access the police, or the commissions, or the protection officers who are there to listen to your complaint if there is been a case of domestic violence. None of these were operational. So where would they go? So anyway, with whatever data we have, this is only tip of the iceberg, and even in there we see an exponential rise in domestic violence. Now the question is that why this sudden rise? And it could be that within a small constricted space, there are multiple members, men who would have left the household usually and would have stayed out even after work, were now compelled to stay indoors, and or and with people losing jobs, etc., that entire anger and frustration was impacting the women. So anyway, with in an extremely patriarchal setup where violence against women is taken for granted, men engaging in psychological violence over and physical violence and sexual violence over the women in the household increased exponentially. People were not accustomed to spending so much of time indoors, and that sort of could be an explanation for the rise in domestic violence, right? So, this is perhaps something that we need to talk about. Also, what was happening to children? And we see that, of course, I can't get into details about what the school closure meant for kids. For upper middle class children, perhaps the school closure um, was bad, but it was not that they would be out of education completely, because in our middle class household with the social capital, children would have continued education by again by mothers and even fathers, but also private schools continued with online education. For children from poorer households for whom online education was not an option, because they do not have access to the internet or to technology or to a laptop or a smartphone, it meant that they were completely outside teaching for about a year. The schools have just started reopening from yesterday, and that to the higher classes. What did it mean for, again, children, both girls and boys? For violent households, again, as I said, getting out of the house, going to school, meeting teachers who were caring about the students, meeting friends was a kind of a panacea. It was a relief for these children. Now, apart from the fact that they are outside the educational framework, they had nowhere to go, which meant that where we have seen that mental illness and depression and various kinds of mental illnesses were on an all-time high. Also, for young children who were facing sexual violence in home, they could not, or their parents or their mothers could not access the police, which works on what we call Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. You could not report a case of child sexual abuse because you could not go out of the house. How would you report child sexual abuse? We have seen that an organization called Childline, where which runs a helpline for children, there have been many such calls, but these calls have been interrupted, or they have also been blank calls, in the sense that somebody must have dialed the number, but because of tremendous surveillance, they could not continue the conversation and seek help. This is true for women as well, that they were trying to reach out, but because of enormous surveillance within the household, they could not report the violence. So, globally and in India, there were interesting mechanisms taken by organized by NGOs as well as state functionaries, that you would ask for help in a disguised manner. So, for example, in India, you had something called a Red Dot Initiative, which was that women who really wanted help, and but this is a little strange, they would wear a very big red bindi and that can go out as a call for help. Now, this is complex because it can also mean that you're anyway wearing a bindi, but it meant that the Red Dot initiative is that you can go and ask for help. In certain other countries, when the lockdown was lifted, and women went to pharmacies or these places, they did it to a pharmacy. And if, say, you go, if a woman who was facing sexual violence went to a pharmacy along with her partner who was abusive, so she can't ask for help. But if she could very surreptitiously say mask 19. Mask 19 was a code word for I need help because I am being tortured at home. So there have been these initiatives that had come up to cope with the kind of violence women were facing. To come back to children, apart from instances of them facing violence at home and also tremendous psychological trauma for being in the house all the time and in a violent household for that matter, we have seen, again, we do not have exact data as of now. The data is emerging of increase in child marriage and trafficking of girls, because we have seen that now you could just get your daughter married off surreptitiously without the state knowing, because the police force is busy trying to clamp down on people. They were trying to manage the lockdown much more than they could go into the interiors and prevent child marriages. So the entire system was kind of geared towards only taking care of the lockdown, and everything else was failing. So a rise in child marriage, and we know that there is also a link between child marriage and trafficking, and the case of missing girls, especially from the 224 parganas, had gone up during the lockdown. So all of this was happening as far as children are concerned. Um, I will come back. I will talk a little bit about the trans population, but before that, let's talk about what have been the things that were noticed during this period. Interestingly, when we talk about violence against women, we mean several kinds of violence, right? So we start from stalking, voyeurism, sexual harassment at workplace, sexual harassment on streets, sexual assault, and rapes. Interestingly, in the first couple of months of the lockdown, these cases were a little low, right? Because of the clampdown. So rapes had gone down, or sexual harassment at workplace had gone down, perhaps due to two reasons. We don't know which is the real one. One is because of the lockdown, people were not venturing out of the house, and therefore both men and women, and the workplaces were also shut, and therefore rapes and assaults and stalking and all of that, and various kinds of abuse. The second is that they were happening, but again, they could not access the police station. It could be both, right? But on the other hand, all of this, if even if we assume that in actuality cases had gone down, on the other hand, this was all compensated by the exponential rise in domestic violence. So if you are looking up the internet, you will see that of the several data that is emerging and news that is emerging on the internet, it is primarily on domestic violence, because it seems that globally the other kinds of violence might have made a little reduction. But it is not true for all countries, and it is not true for all regions either. So in certain countries, in certain regions, there is no one-to-one correspondence between the lockdown and rates of rape going down. Clearly, we can't say it's for sure. So let us come back to what several countries have done to deal with this. So In Argentina and Brazil, and I'm not talking about what the states have done, countries have done. So, in Argentina and Brazil, for domestic violence cases, and in India also under the domestic violence law, we have something called protection orders, right? This is a civil law called Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. And the magistrate could give certain protection orders, right? And the protection order means that if the woman is facing violence from the male partner or from any other male household member, then that household member will have a restriction order, and the woman and the male household member can also be removed from the household, and the woman cannot be removed or thrown out of her matrimonial home or her natal home under any circumstances. This is the first point of the law, that women cannot be thrown out of their shelters, right? So in Argentina and Brazil, these protection orders are renewed, and there were automatic extensions and renewal of such protection orders. Say the protection order was for 6 months, and then the lockdown happened, the pandemic happened. So automatically the protection orders were renewed, which is that women cannot be thrown out of their households. In Malaysia, Peru, and Puerto Rico, and I'm referring to countries which are not what we call technically first world countries only. They started an online or a mobile app, the way the National Commission of Women had also done in India, an online or a mobile app in which they could send complaints, and it was an app to seek various kinds of help, right? Courts had shut down, and so if you're talking about justice mechanism, we know that in India courts were completely shut. So if you were facing violence, then in domestic violence, you cannot access the court to get protection from domestic violence or file what you call a criminal cruelty charge of 498A. There was no way. The courts were not functioning. But in Botswana, Bulgaria, Poland, and Turkey, for urgent cases, the courts were open to listen to those cases. In Bangladesh, the courts were doing virtual hearings. Now, this is really not the best of modes, because for a virtual hearing to happen, the woman will have to have an access to some kind of a device, which is perhaps not possible, and she would be able, not only will be free and not be under surveillance to access and do the virtual hearings, but at least there was something that women could at least do a virtual hearing, and the court will try to give you some relief. In Australia and several other countries, a lot of psychological assistance was given, especially in cases of when people were facing psychological trauma, etc., etc. And this also happened in India, and especially various hospitals and specialized hospitals like NIMHANS, mental health initiatives, both in the private sector. They had started free helplines to enable anyone, not only women, but enable anyone, and especially women, to sometime to access virtual psychological services, to do counseling and therapy online, and also free assistance, free psychological assistance had also happened in Kolkata. There were several hotlines that had emerged in Jamaica and Thailand, and there were also many shelters that were opened up in many parts of the globe, right? So domestic violence shelters were opened up so that if you are in a violent household, just run away and get to that shelter. And these shelters worked overtime 24/7 for any women to access. This has also, the opening up of the shelter, of having hotlines, also happened across India in many states. In Maharashtra, in Telangana, there were many such hotlines, helplines, and shelters which were opened up for which were open 24/7 to women to get some reprieve, run out, and access those shelters. I don't know any such specific case in West Bengal. If they were only far and in between, run by a couple of NGOs which work on domestic violence. But really, I don't know if they were completely run by the state. Maybe a few, but not really in large numbers, which the pandemic necessitated. So it is extremely important that we have these shelters for safe houses for women who face domestic violence to access. Also, in Maharashtra, we know that this works successfully. So the One Stop Crisis Center, which is there in Maharashtra for a few years now, also was working overtime, where you can run for any case on violence, not only domestic violence, and they were also working 24/7. Again, in many other states, including West Bengal, there is no one-stop crisis center, and so we really don't know if we could go there. So, what do we need? So, post-pandemic, what should be the policy response? The policy response that states need to undertake, and the center needs to undertake, is to start with more money and more resources to combat violence against women. And these could be resources in terms of not only economic, but also resources in terms of personnel. If you would know that that across India and in West Bengal, there is only one protection officer per district. Now imagine a district like South 24 Parganas. So it starts really, the court, the South 24 Parganas court is Alipur. So from Alipur court into Pathor Pratima, which is way down across the Sundarban, this is all South 24 Parganas, and you have one domestic violence protection officer. Where we'll forget the pandemic, even if it was not the pandemic, it would be so difficult for women to access. So we need more resources, and after the pandemic, we need it all the more. We want more resources and more personnel to come in here. What is the state doing in order to combat economic insecurity of women? So women who have lost, both men and women, but since we are talking about women in informal labor force, what is the state doing to enable women to come back to at least to the informal labor force? We know about the free ration that has been supplied consistently since the lockdown in West Bengal and in other parts of India, but also perhaps cash transfers, say something on the lines of Konyasri that we know, which is a cash transfers, but many more such cash transfers initiatives should start. The entire police force, which was concentrated on the lockdown, now we need clearly the police force that needs to concentrate only on women. So it was a suggestion during the lockdown itself that if for several thanas, there could be, for each thana, there could be one or two police personnel who would be earmarked to listen to cases of violence. Like, don't put entire force into combating the lockdown, because if you, at least for one or two thanas, or if it is in Kolkata, then for a cluster of thanas, get a couple of police personnel who could respond to a case of violence in the household. That was extremely necessary, but we see that was not coming through. Also, virtual hearings could have come. The courts could have worked on an urgent basis, which was all taken away during the lockdown. And we need to do certain things. We need to prioritize such cases of harassment and violence within the household for all of this at this point of time. Where will these women go? So with all of that, I would like to end with that we are talking about women, but since we are talking about gender justice, we also need to talk about transgender people, and not only cis heterosexual women. For trans people who live precarious lives, the home is the site of violence as well. So for this effeminate man, or for the trans man, or for the trans woman, for them, the home is the place which inflicts violence on them. Could be psychological, could be sexual, could be anything. And for trans people, it was going outside the home, meeting people outside, meeting with their peers, which gave them reprieve, and all that stopped. Also, it could be that they were forced to live in a gender identity that they did not identify themselves with. So you could have a man who had to, a trans man who had to be like a woman in the household and do work that is expected of woman, or for a trans woman who had to behave like a man in the household, but otherwise they could have gone out and dressed as women, and that is what a lot of trans persons also do, and they earn their employment also as a trans women. All of that stopped. And also, to end with the most marginalized, we know, and there has been some work about also sex workers who were completely outside this framework, and we don't even think of them, because for them sex work is work, and we know that all of that had completely come down. What are we doing? What has the state done for all of these, the most marginalized people, for hijras, kotis, sex workers? And we see that the lockdown had affected them in a very, very negative way. So it is time to come around. And if we have good policies which prioritize gender justice, even then it would take us at least till 2030 or more to come back to where we are. And in the midst of where there is a complete crunch in jobs, massive rise in unemployment, cutting down of all kinds of benefits, it is going to be a very, very uphill battle to keep on demanding more and more resources to be invested in gender. Have to keep on struggling about that. With that, I would end, and if there is time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Goswami, for your incisive lecture, wonderful lecture. You focused many aspects in your lecture, from the domestic violence of women in during this pandemic period, and even you highlighted also the school-going children and the psychological condition of the poor children in this period, and child trafficking, child marriage. And also you compare the different data, different country scenario in the world, and also refer some states in India, and also mention some policies in your lecture. Wonderful, ma'am, wonderful. On behalf of organizing committee, I just want to thank you once again. And I would like to request now Ms. Isha Vishwas to conduct the question answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Ray.
Yeah, thank
Dr.
you. Thank you.
Goswami, this is a question that we have got from our FB Live. It goes like this: disasters usually shape the course of history. Like in the wake of the Spanish flu of 1918, more women had entered the labor market. So has COVID-19 pandemic proved to be an opportunity to transform gender inequalities?
To quickly compare, yes, agree with the point that disasters had given opportunity to women to join the labor force, and the World War is an example of that, if not the other pandemics. But if you ask me, I'm answering not with the help of data. I'll have to access that. But I don't see that coming as an opportunity for women this time around, because there is a complete global cutting down of all kinds of public sector initiatives. We have seen the economy on an all-time low, and it's globally, the pandemic has thrown the economy completely out of gear. In this context, as I was saying, for women to even come back to their original position in the labor force will be difficult. I don't see that they're going to get more opportunities, and the global economic inequality between men and women will come down. I think, and as lots of studies have shown, that has anyway increased. So anyway, we now have to close the gap. Forget that it will give an opportunity to women, and it's not giving an opportunity to men as well. So I don't see where the global gender pay gap is anyway so bad. I don't see this giving us an opportunity. At least I don't see this now.
Touched upon in your lecture, the question goes: women live at the intersections of many identities, and how does that affect who they are and how they are treated?
This is a very big question on intersectionality, and I don't think that we have time to discuss this. Yes, but as I was saying, and I sort of ended on that point, that when we are talking about women, then which women, and Professor John was also referring to that, women live very different kinds of identities. So when a pandemic or anything, a policy, a pandemic like this strikes, then it strikes people differently. So the virus doesn't, it sort of increases social inequalities. And if you happen to be Dalit, poor, marginal farmer, um, woman with disability, maybe lesbian, or maybe a sex worker, you are out of job. The more precarious existence women had prior to the pandemic, that precarity would have just increased after the pandemic. So perhaps the most beneficial, the people who've been benefited in the pandemic, or who was at least able to hold their heads above the water, would be somebody who comes from a privileged background like me. So the pandemic has clearly shown what privilege does, right? And the invisibility of privilege. I don't see, oh my God, I have to do all the housework, but I'm far more privileged than like millions of women globally, right? So intersectionality only shows this, that a pandemic sort of brings into stark contrast the existing inequalities and prejudices. It only increases that. It does not decrease the disability. And I think the kotis and the sex workers are a very good point. I don't think they're coming back to job anyway very time soon, whatever be our position on sex work be.
Thank you so much, madam, especially because you have touched upon the LGBTQIA plus issues as well in this section. I would ask Dr. Alpanare to introduce our next speaker for the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vishwas. Now we are proceeding to the last lecture of the session, and I would like to welcome Professor Rupkini Shane in the session. She is a Director, Center for Publishing, Professor Sociology, School of Liberal Studies, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Professor Rupkini Shane completed her BA in Sociology from Presidency College, ranking first from the University of Calcutta, and her Masters in Sociology from the Center for Studies in Social Systems, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has obtained her PhD in Sociology, Department of Sociology, University of Calcutta. She has served as an assistant professor in West Bengal National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata. She was a junior fellow at the Center for Women Development Studies, New Delhi. She is currently serving as professor of sociology at the School of Liberal Studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi, and also as director, Center for Publishing, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Her area of expertise include sociology of law, sociology of kinship and intimacy, feminist and pedagogy of jurisprudence, qualitative research methods and courses in gender and society, politics, law and society, violence, feminist resistance and critics, women's and movements, etc. She has received WISCOM, Women in Security, Conflict Management and Peace, Sahas Awards in 2020, recognizing continuous engagement with the curricula using a intersectional lens and courageous efforts to bring structural shifts in the everyday functioning of higher education spaces through innovative pedagogy and counseling. She received the International Visitor Leadership Program on Human Rights Awareness from the US State Department of Education and Cultural Affairs in 2007 and was the only women from India. Professor Sain is serving as member core group on women at National Human Rights Commission, New Delhi, since 2019 and member expert committee, National Commission for Women. She has served as a member advisory board, Feminist Judgments Initiative, Gujarat National Law University, India, advisory member, country reference group for research project sustaining power for women rights in South Asia, jointly to be conducted between the Indian Social Studies Trust with the Institute of Development Studies, IDS, Sussex, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, UK, between 2020 and 23. She is a member of the advisory board for the book series Education Research in the Global Context with Emerald Publications. She is a member of the editorial board for the book series International Perspectives on Gender-Based Violence with Triven Publishing, Budapest. She has co-edited several books and has been the special issue editor for journals like the Economic and Political Weekly, Engage. She has written chapters in several edited volumes and has published articles in several journals of national and international repute. Professor Sain also regularly writes blogs and articles for popular online magazines. She has delivered lecture at several premier national and global institutions. She has delivered a keynote address at Writing the Self, Working with the Social, Feminist Reflections on Knowing and Knowledge, in Decolonizing Feminist Knowledge, Reflections on Research and Curriculum, workshop at the University of Edinburgh, UK, and at National Seminar on Succession, Act and Women, organized by the Tarabai Shinde Women Studies Center, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad. Her recent research project is titled Pandemic and its Gendered Impacts, a study of women faculty in higher education institutions in India in response to ICSSR special call for studies focusing on social science dimensions of COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. Now, I would like to request and welcome her also in this session. Ma'am, please. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alpana Roy, for that really detailed and warm introduction. And I would like to thank the principal of Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis Mahavidyalaya, the IQAC coordinator, and of course a very, very special thanks to Dr. Shreyoshi Chatterjee. One is delighted when ex-students become college teachers and then they reach out to their own teachers. That's the relation that I have with Shreyoshi, and I would like to thank her and Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis Mahavidyalaya for organizing this really, really important webinar on decoding the pandemic, understanding the complex issues of gender violence amidst the lockdown. I'm very, very happy to be part of this webinar. Let me start with an essay that I myself wrote in the early days. I would think of the pandemic when, discussions around domestic violence was the rise of domestic violence was actually coming through, and I had titled this essay "Stay Home, Stay Safe: Interrogating Violence in the Domestic Sphere," and this was published in DPW. And I will take certain key things from this essay and then build upon with respect to recent data around domestic violence. So I think one of the first things that we need to remember when we engage with the concept of rising rates of domestic violence during the pandemic, I would think would be the first, social distancing advisory, that is how it was titled, that the government of India, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, had released on the 16th of March 2020. Through this advisory, the ministry had advised students to stay at home and had laid down the guidelines for instituting work from home wherever it was feasible. With the exception of essential travel, movement for everything else was actually stopped. So in some senses, we'll have to keep this context of the advisory in mind, because what the advisory was doing was clearly asking people to stay home, and also thinking that home is the safe space to stay. Probably in terms of encountering the virus, that space was a safe space. However, while stay home was connected with stay safe, one feels that erased warnings and also empirical data that home is not really a safe space somehow seemed to have been missed through the government advisory, not just in the Indian context, but globally. And we'll talk about some global numbers as we move ahead. The other important thing from that advisory that we need to take cognizance of is that when the advisory says work from home, it of course, understands work in the context of, work that is established, organized, either in the government sector or in the public corporate sector or in educational institutions. So work has a very defined understanding of with respect to the fact that people go outside of their home to work. And when the advisory says work from home, the advisory then gets limited to the extent that there is already a lot of work that happens inside the home. So, I'm kind of alluring to questions around domestic labor, again, debates that, feminists worldwide have talked about. So what happens as a result of an advisory like this is that there is work from home and there is also work at home. And we are all aware of the gendered nature of who does more work inside the home. So sexual division of labor being strong and active, we understand how an advisory of work from home is going to affect more and more women who also work at home. So I'm kind of trying to say that from the very beginning, that the pandemic was supposed to have very differential gendered implications was very clear from some of these advisories. I just looked at the Government of India advisory, given that it is, for us to engage with the most. What we saw very early, and I've always felt that this was interesting, that, with respect to the pandemic, with respect to this public health crisis, we did see questions about and as if acknowledgement of the fact that domestic violence exists and domestic violence has actually increased during the pandemic. We saw reporting of this quite early in the days of the pandemic. And by early, I'm saying by March end, you actually had the UN telling us that domestic violence is the shadow pandemic. So that's the word that we hear from the UN coming, but it is coming in quite early into the pandemic, which actually means then that there is a way in which this recognition that the pandemic is impacting women differently, women inside the homes differently, and many people together being inside the homes, because that is what the advisory is, that acknowledgement and that recognition comes. So to that extent, I think, we need to take cognizance of that the word shadow pandemic actually comes into our lexicon quite early in the early days of the pandemic. Very recent, November 2020, UN Women releases a data which says that roughly about 243 million women and girls between the age group of 15 to 49 years have been subjected to domestic violence during the pandemic. And this is a worldwide figure. They break it down. I don't go into the details of that into different countries. And we we have to remember that when we are looking at this data, we still will have to look at the data which was a pre-pandemic data, which is that 1 in 3 women, according to the UN Women data, before COVID-19 had experienced physical or sexual violence primarily from their intimate partners. So what one is trying to actually point out is that domestic violence is high and is a reality, is something that we see UN Women recognizing from the very beginning. And to top it all, the pandemic actually, and stay at home, work from home, actually increases that those numbers tremendously. In this context, in the increase in numbers, a few data to remember, again from UN Women's statistics, and this was released in April 2020. It said that in France, domestic violence rates had gone up by 30% during the pandemic, in Argentina by 25%, in Singapore by 33%. Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, US, everybody showed increase in rates of domestic violence. When we come to India, we also know, according to the National Crime Records Bureau 2018 data, that domestic violence tops crimes against women, with the majority of cases being registered under cruelty by husbands or his relatives. And this is about 31.9% as per the 2018 NCRB data. And this is followed by assault on women with intent to outrage her modesty, followed by kidnapping and abduction, followed by rape. But what I'm trying to say is that despite, all of these facts and figures available, there was actually no separate thought that was given to what impact a pandemic-induced forced lockdown could have on violence inside the home. So by the time Google created a doodle which was titled "Stay Home, Save Lives," and this was roughly in the middle of March 2020, the doodle said, "Stay home, save lives, help stop the coronavirus." News about the increase in domestic violence cases in India had actually started coming in. And by this time, you had the National Commission for Women in India coming out with the first figures. And according to the first report on domestic violence increase during the pandemic in India, which was released in April 3rd, 2020, the NCW said that they had received 257 complaints between 23rd March 2020 and April 1st, 2020, among which 69 were cases of domestic violence. At that point in time, this figure actually had also increased dramatically between between the first few days of the pandemic, March end to beginning of April, which according to NCW was a twofold increase in the number of cases of domestic violence. If we look currently, and I was looking into figures of the NCW and what is the NCW saying right now. So the last kind of report that I see was between, around September, October, where the NCW has said that during the lockdown, in India, domestic violence figures have increased by 2.5% since the lockdown. Yeah. So it's still, the early data was a twofold increase. And by the time we come to about October, NCW says that it is about 2.5 times, the increase in domestic violence figures. So what we see, again, as an immediate response in those, early days of the pandemic, we We saw the Delhi High Court in April 2020 through a two-judge bench directing the central government as well as the Delhi state government to deliberate on measures to curb and protect women facing domestic violence and to effectively implement the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005. Further, the NCW also announced a WhatsApp number on April 10, 2020, in addition to the online complaint links and emails which were already operational. It is important for us to, make note of the fact that this is the first time that NCW actually came up with a WhatsApp number. We'd also have to remember that when we introduce a WhatsApp number as a response to kind of report cases on domestic violence, we will have to remember that who has access to smartphones. There are studies in India which very clearly say that women and girl children have much lesser access to smartphones than, young boys and men. Having said that, this was one of the initial attempts that NCW did. But other than NCW, there were, other state level, responses to the increased rates of domestic violence. In one of the early initiatives taken by the Uttar Pradesh police, there was a Hindi newspaper advertisement on 20th March 2020 saying, "Suppress Corona, not your voice," asking women to dial 112 to make complaints and 4 women police officers to make home visits subsequently. Among some other initiatives taken by state commissions include the telecounseling facility started by the State Commission for Women in Kerala. So this was an early attempt to give relief to women suffering from stress and anxiety while staying within the home, which is what the Kerala Directorate of Women and Child Development of the Kerala government had actually said. Odisha Police, together with the State Crime Records Bureau, had also initiated a special drive, which they called the Phone Up program, across the state to deal with the problems of domestic violence in the crisis period. In Punjab, which had seen an over 21% increase in the number of crimes against women, because of the lockdown and the curfew, there were again attempts that were made by Punjab police to, redress. All of this is that a number of attempts were created by different government initiatives, also the police. There were other sources and other kinds of initiatives that were taken, and I want to mention one, like Women Entrepreneurs for Transformation, WEFT Foundation, which is a non-profit body working for women's empowerment. They had launched a new initiative which was called the Red Dot, under which citizens could identify a domestic violence victim by seeing a red dot on her palm and inform NGOs or other authorities. Now, this was literally in line with certain other, international efforts that were taken, one being in Spain, where because it was not possible for women to actually use the phone from their home to complain to the police that she is facing domestic violence, because probably from the person who is facing domestic violence, that person is also at home at that point of time. Spain came up with, some kind of an initiative where women could report incidents in pharmacy. So if they had to go to buy medicines, there was a code word that they could write on their palm, and through it, that pharmacy person would understand that she's trying to communicate something more than just buy medicines. So these kinds of, other initiatives were taken, and Red Dot in the Indian context, I would feel, is one such initiative. Of course, women's organizations across the country, again, very early responded to, this rising incidence of domestic violence. One of the organizations, Shakti Shalini in Delhi or even Swayam in Calcutta, they came up with helpline numbers and circulated through social media as to what are the helplines that women could reach out to. As per through a report of the International Disability Alliance recommendation, what came clearly out in the context of women with disability framework was that there was an increase in violence from of course partners, but also personal attendants, as stress levels within the household has increased. And most importantly, to remember with respect to persons with disability was that there was also no community watch, or community was kind of absent, primarily because everybody was inside, for to address violence that women with disability face from their partners as well as from their attendants. So in some cases, caregivers were not able to reach those who depend on them. And moreover, access to medicine and groceries were, very difficult for women with disability to kind of reach and understand. A very different kind of an impact was, seen or faced by sex workers. And some early studies on sex workers in Mumbai, Kolkata, and Madhya Pradesh suggested that sex workers received no assistance from the government, and they've barely any money to get by, feed their families, or even buy medicines. Sex workers living in cramped brothels were also particularly susceptible to COVID-19. And, one of the things that I have always wondered, and I kind of argue and I end with that kind of a proposition also, that when you say stay home, what is even the imagination of the home for the state? The imagination of the home for the state is clearly a heteronormative, monogamous family where there is marriage, where there is children. That is the kind of a home that is there. And we all understand that there are various other domestic arrangements, or there are various other shared household in which various people live and various women also live. So how will we think about shelter homes? How will we think about, areas and residences where sex workers live? How will we think about, let's say, hostels? All of these are places where people live. So it is a shared household. But in the understanding of stay home, stay safe, the home kind of was a very restrictive, imagination. Coming back to, a report around the sex workers, it was clear that violence that sex workers faced within brothels were not constitutive of, domestic violence as per the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act. So relocation from these crowded spaces, relocation from these brothels were actually suggested by the court in order to ensure social distancing, but that also meant increasing surveillance by police into the lives of sex workers, which would deeply impact their economy. And we've also seen newspaper reports which suggest that many sex workers actually have to go back to their, homes from cities. So cities were spaces that they had come for work, and in many situations, they actually had to flee abusive homes to come to the city for work. And the pandemic, in some ways, created a situation that, they had to probably go back to these abusive spaces. So keeping, all of this in mind, it is also probably important to remember that it is not just this pandemic which has shown that there are differential gendered implications. We might go back to remember that UNICEF's technical note on COVID-19 and harmful practices in April 2020, it referred back to the Ebola crisis, wherein adolescent girls were disproportionately affected by the consequent emergencies. Efforts to stop the Ebola, a decrease in access to reproductive health information and services, a loss of livelihood, and contraction of social support networks. So these seriously undermined strategies also to end female genital mutilation and child marriage and threatened the progress that has been attained previously. So what I'm trying to say is that the pandemic is not the first time that we are seeing increased domestic violence in a spate of public health crisis. There are previous public health crises like the Ebola. Of course, one could go back to the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague, but but Ebola is more close in just in terms of time. So those reports also indicate that there are these heightened risks. Closer home, in the Indian context, maybe not a public health crisis, but women were affected more than men by the Bhopal gas disaster. While their children were born with congenital defects, they too suffered health complications such as early menopause. And many who had lived in confinement due to the Parada system or female seclusion found themselves having to find paid work due to the death or incapacitation of their menfolk. The Bhuj earthquake in Gujarat also had left many women in an especially vulnerable position, suffering not only psychological damage, but also economic insecurity, etc. And, a similar is the story with respect to even the tsunami widowers, and, where reports have come in from Sri Lanka, from Chennai, etc., as to how it impacts women and girls much differently. So I think through all of this, what I'm trying to suggest is that we always knew that a public health crisis is going to have very differential, not just differential, very hierarchical, gendered implications with respect to domestic violence, with respect to economy. We already have, reports, empirical data that has been conducted in the Indian context by Professor Ashwini Deshpande, the economist, and others, about how the pandemic very clearly shows that the female labor force participation has actually gone down pandemic. As it was low. So those kind of figures are already there. And we also see clearly increased rates of domestic violence. I'm kind of trying to suggest that we need to understand the increase in domestic violence during the pandemic, one in a broader historical kind of a context, in order for us to even think ways ahead. And we also have to understand rise in the increase in domestic violence in connection with what is happening to women labor force participation, and refer to studies by Deshpande and others. The last point that I would want to say in the 5-6 minutes that I have is that I think two kinds of ways in which, for the future, to think about ways in which one could address some of the issues. So I'll start with actually a positive. I felt that it was a very interesting positive initiative that was taken. Very interestingly, in a backward district, as per the census, a backward district called Mewat in Haryana. ITO community initiative actually did a program which was called Hinsa Ko No. The no is N-O, no. And this was supported by the Azim Premji Philanthropy Initiative. Now, what happened through this is that this NGO in any case worked with women in that village and took care of their economic empowerment. Yeah, it's been there for the last 1 year. Now, from these initiatives, women visited homes in different households of the village to provide cloth, teach them making masks, inquire about well-being, etc. But through this, they also learned stories and cases of domestic violence. Yeah, so I'm kind of trying to think that that Red Dot initiative, the writing on the palm, going to the pharmacy, here you actually have women volunteers and women workers, NGO workers coming into the homes with, trying to train them with respect to, making masks, etc., but also hearing from them about their well-being. And these stories and cases which would feed in to the community radio initiative in Mewat's program. And that would be used for extensive messaging on domestic violence and mental health. So that is one, initiative which is already in place, and which in some senses was responding, I would think, to already existing government schemes like one-stop centers, Ujjwala homes, emergency response support system. Now, the thing is that all of these actually exist, but kind of remains optional in terms of its usage. And this particular initiative, I felt, was, kind of tying in, dovetailing to the schemes that the government of India has with respect to questions about domestic violence. So that's one kind of a response. Another, kind of a response that I feel is very, very necessary for the future, and that needs to be a demand that comes from women's organizations, but also, I would think, from state commissions for women and National Commission for Women to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, would be, so the pandemic actually showed us, or, made us encounter with a word, essential services. And essential services was what was open, right, during, so people who are part of essential services were people who could actually go out, or essential services were not supposed to be stopped even during the strict lockdown of those 2 months. With the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, it is extremely valuable that there are two kinds of suggestions that we give. One is 24/7 counseling facilities, and how is it that the state would ensure those counseling facilities through phone, through mobile apps, through community radio, given that, mobile phones may not be, especially smartphones may not be available. So how will that be possible to think about 24/7 instant counseling services? Second, rehabilitation and access to mental health services and access to shelter homes need to be made part of essential services. Because what we realized is that women who were even wanting to go out, even wanting to, make these complaints, couldn't do so, primarily because these shelter homes either are non-functional, their funding is very less, or during the pandemic, women couldn't access it. So how do you make access to shelter homes as an important essential service? So these two or three things, more in terms of responses and more operational responses in operational gender just responses in a post-pandemic world. But the last thing that I would want to say would also be that there needs to be a conceptual reimagination response. And that conceptual reimagination gender just response would be to reconceptualize the home or the domesticity itself. And this is where I would go back to what I had said earlier, that there is a very specific understanding of the home that we saw was reinforced. That understanding of the home was reinforced. And how is it that, we talk about the home in a more broader way, not just with respect to monogamous, marriage-based, biological reproduction-based understanding of the home, but how do we understand home, or how do we understand housing as a collective need? And what is it that we say, how is it that we argue about a right to housing, or a right to maybe collective housing? Because working women's hostels, flat sharing by migrant adult women to cities, pursuing higher education or jobs, are present in substantial proportions. And yet these facilities are required as if till women get married. So the matrimonial home or the married home kind of still remains the framework. So how is it that we reconceptualize the home and demand and talk about civic, community-based, abuse-free, secure, livable housing? That should also be a reconceptualized understanding of the home and the domestic space and a gender just response to the pandemic. So one, an operationalized kind of a response, another, a conceptual reimagination. Both of these would be necessary for a future gender just initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your enlightening speech on the different aspects of domestic violence on women. And also you mentioned a lot of government schemes to protect the violence. Now I would like to ask Ms. Isha Bishash to conduct the question answer session for the ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. For Professor Shane, we have two questions here. The first is, violence is, since it's not always connected to marriage, and since your lecture focuses on different kinds of shared residences, is this the right time to think about collective housing for women?
Yeah, I think I did indicate that towards the end of the talk, that there is a need to think about and demand, some kind of collective residence, which is, which I said, needs to also be affordable. I think that is a very, very valuable point, primarily because, I do feel that the way in which we have understood that, where can women stay, or where is it that women usually stay? Clearly, one is the matrimonial home, the other is the home where she's born, right? So between these two, as if there isn't any other space. So we need to actually remember two things here as we maybe move towards a different kind of a demand or an agenda. One is that we need to remember that the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act gives us a definition of domestic relationship and also gives us a definition of shared household. But together with it, the PWDVA ensures right to residence. And I think it is, so what I'm trying to say is that whatever future demand we talk about in terms of housing, in terms of affordable, livable housing, it kind of maybe needs to be based on what the law has already given. So, it's already there. So there is a certain journey that we have made by the law recognizing right to residence for all, with not just married women, but right to residence for all women. So we can top that up through a demand like this. But I think what would be important for us, in this context, is to also remember that housing or collective questions around housing has actually existed. Demands around housing has actually existed in a very different sphere of social movement. It has existed with respect to issues around development-induced displacement, slum rehabilitation, etc. And those have been spaces, we actually have a collective housing kind of a group that exists, and those have been spaces from where housing has been a demand. Yeah, but that is somehow connected, that has been always connected with displacement, yeah, slum demolition and the need for housing. And kind of trying to say that there are two pegs which already exist. One is right to residence in the PWDVA. The other is land and housing rights that exist. When we talk about collective housing, affordable collective housing for women outside of the marriage framework, these are the two pegs through which we can build upon. I'm sorry, I'm not being able to hear you.
Sorry, ma'am. I had switched off my mic. Sorry. How has additional care duties impacted vulnerable genders? For example, the domestic workers or long-term care workers or nurses and even women physicians who are caring for others while having to leave their own families and children behind.
Thank you very much for that question. I think domestic worker was a category which I did not talk about when I was kind of, talking about, different intersectional and social location women, when during my speech. So, we know that the domestic workers during the pandemic has been affected in two ways. One was that when the pandemic began and, there is the shutting down of shutting down of spaces, those who are not 24/7 domestic workers, so those who are not live-in domestic workers, they were, one of the first people to be told that you cannot enter our house. Yeah, because, everybody, not just them, everybody was, but they were also not allowed. But I think the way it affected was that when, from June, we started reopening of spaces, right? So we've gone through phases of lockdown and we've also gone through phases of unlockdown, and now we are into the reopening phase. So what happened during those phases of unlockdown is that for these domestic workers to then come back, and I'm speaking from the context in which I live, resident welfare associations in Delhi, they played a horribly stigmatizing role with respect to domestic workers. They actually said the domestic workers have to get their corona test done before they can even enter the colony. In Bombay, the Domestic Workers Union actually came out with a statement saying that if the RWAs in Bombay, not in Delhi, if the RWAs want us to do corona tests to enter their homes, then we would also want, where we are going to work, they also have to do corona tests before we could enter those spaces. So that was a kind of a response that we got. However, the other part of your question that you said is important with respect to, care workers who actually acted as primary healthcare workers, not just within houses, but also, as nurses or as ayas or as a huge amount of people who are part of what is known as ASHA workers. They are not even understood as workers, they are actually volunteers. And this pandemic showed how vulnerable and how vulnerable their position actually is. And I would believe that, just like we need to talk about, heightened domestic violence figures and what we do as a response, just like we have to talk about female labor force participation and increased response, the pandemic is also an important time to talk about social security measures for domestic workers, to talk about or to include ASHA workers, healthcare workers as workers, to be recognized as workers by the government of India.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. We will now hereby conclude the first session of our webinar, but we'll be back after lunch break and we'll resume and begin the second session at 1:45 sharp. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you, Isha. Thank you, Ms. Vishwas. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much to everyone. And I would just like to repeat that we will be coming back sharp at 1:45 p.m. We are breaking now for lunch for half an hour, but we will be resuming sharp at 1:45 p.m. Thank you.